Welcome to Just Minding My Business Radio, where we are moving at the speed of God, learning what we didn't know we didn't know. I'm your host, Ida Crawford.
And I'm your co-host, Ruth Haskins.
So grab a pen and paper and get ready for information that you can use.
Welcome to Just Minding My Business Media. I hope you had an amazing day. Today, when we talk about health, we can't just focus on physical health, such as heart, liver, or brain health. We have to look at mind and body as a whole and understand that they work together. Coming to the mic today is T-Kea Blackman, who is a mental health advocate, speaker, and author who lives by the Toni Payne quote, "I'd rather be living my truth happily than living a lie miserably." I love that. T-Kea is the creator and host of the Fireflies Unite With Kea, a weekly podcast dedicated to bringing light into darkness, just like the fireflies. Well, welcome T-Kea to the show. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about this important topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just ask, there's reasons why people begin to do things. What was your reason for starting such a important advocacy?
So the reason being was because of my personal experience. So I was diagnosed in 2015 with generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. And I am also a suicide survivor. And with my background, so my previous background, I have my undergraduate degree is in radio, television, and film production, and my master's is in corporate comm and PR. And so I really was trying to figure out a way, how can I merge my new passion of mental health because of my personal experience and use the skills that I was using to really spark the mental health conversation. And so that's what really brought about Fireflies Unite. And originally it started as a podcast, and then it has grown to, me speaking and my books and a future nonprofit. And so that has really been like the catalyst for it. It's just because of my personal experience of surviving suicide. And I saw how so many people in my community, in the African American community, were afraid to talk about their mental health challenges and were really fearful because of the stigma, or just because of, our some people who do identify with the Christian faith saying like, oh, they just need to pray harder or you'll be fine. When in reality, we can pray and see a therapist at the same time. And so I really wanted to dispel the myth that if you sought mental health treatment, it meant that you lack faith in God.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing to that, we Just Minding My Business Media is huge on this subject. We interview all the time about mental health because it's important to us to make sure that people hear constantly that, our mind and our bodies are connected. So if our minds are not sound, then we need to do something about that. And it's okay. It's just like going to the doctors. If you break your leg, you're not going to walk around with a broken leg.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting is that I remember when I was in the hospital. So when I had my suicide attempt, I was actually essentially forced into the hospital. And I remember being in the psychiatric unit and one of the ladies on the floor telling me, she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, I don't belong here. And she said, "What do you mean you don't belong here?" I said, "Well, I have a bachelor's from Howard and a master's from Georgetown." So in my mind, I thought I was too educated to be on the psychiatric unit with those people, and I put those in air quotes because I certainly did belong there, but at the time I didn't believe it. And I thought that because, if a person has, if they have a successful career, or they have degrees, or they have money some kind of way, it means that you're exempt, or that you couldn't possibly experiencing any mental health challenges, because I limited at the time to people who may be talking to themselves or hearing things. That's just one side of people who battle with mental health disorders. It's a huge spectrum. And at that time, she said to me, well, your brain is an organ, just like you said, your brain is an organ, just like your heart is an organ. And if you don't take care of your brain gets sick, and that's why you're here, because you need to get well. Your brain isn't well. And for some reason that really stuck with me. And I slowly started to accept that, well, no, I'm not crazy. And two, I do need to be here because I have to get the help that I need in order to get better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. That is just huge. And I think that once we start to look at it differently, then it makes a whole world of difference as to the next steps we take.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because our perception, and and not all of that is our fault, because most times there has been a stigma. It's just the last few years where people are talking out about it and understanding that it can happen to anybody. It has no particular class of people. It doesn't matter what your wealth is or anything like that, but it can happen to anybody.
Absolutely. It can happen to anybody. And I think the thing is, sometimes we think that it can't happen to us just because a lot of times you think that, well, it can't happen to me because it happens to other people. It's like sometimes you don't believe that something will happen until it it's on your doorstep.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly didn't think anything like that would ever happen to me. I mean, honestly, I started struggling with suicidal thoughts at 12 years old. It's just that by the time I was in my early to mid 20s, it's just that was the time that it actually started to get worse, because I had suppressed it for so many years that at that time I could no longer control the suicidal thoughts. At that point, it was too much, because I never treated it. I was never treated for it.
Mm-hmm. This is what I'm hearing. Thank you so much for sharing so honestly, T-Kea. What you're saying is very, very true. So many young people, mental health issues begin at a very early age, or they can begin at a very early age. And in our community, they are often ignored, brushed under the table. And it can be that family members are very much aware that there is a problem. It could be something such as sexual molestation. It could be verbal abuse. It could be a number of things that set it off. But because we do not pay attention to it, and as you said, there is a stigma to mental health, and it's very, very interesting that we don't pay attention. It's like we put on blinders and ignore situations that we know can only get worse. So very often you have these things that are going on in childhood. Everybody knows it. It's like the family secret. And then when it finally blossoms, everyone wants to stand back and act like they didn't know that it could possibly happen. The person who's involved, like yourself or myself or anyone, we know something's going on, but because we're surrounded by people who are in denial, we have nowhere to go until it becomes such an issue that it explodes all over the place. And you're not alone. There were a lot of people on that psych ward, and some of them had the same thing: good educations, good families, nice homes. So the question always becomes, what happened? And that is it's almost like we have to get to that and say we are our mental health is so important to us that we are going to pay attention. We're going to pay attention to our children. We're going to pay attention to what's going on in our homes so that our children do not have to have that experience of winding up on a psych ward. Perhaps we can catch it earlier. And it's not just the psych ward, it's in prisons. A lot of our young Black men are in prison because of mental health issues that were ignored or totally denied.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting. Of course, we know a lot starts from childhood. And so I think the biggest thing for me, or what triggered that, essentially, as a child, I did watch my mom be verbally and physically abused by my siblings' dad. And I did watch my dad struggle with addiction challenges. And growing up in a low-income community where, substance use and addiction challenges are all around. Like, I remember seeing crack bottles in the hallway and of my apartment building that I lived in, or like urine in the hallways. And being born to a teenage mom, of course, and you live in, what we call public housing, you are exposed to a lot. And so that did shape me as a person, and really was some of the key things that led to my mental health challenges and no longer being treated. I mean, and it wasn't treated at the time. I believe my mom did the best that she could with what she had. And, she worked really hard to move us out of the neighborhood that we lived in to a better neighborhood. But at the same time, those were the experiences that I saw, and how it really impacted my mental health. And I didn't think that it impacted me until, of course, I had that breakdown. And you're right, that's when family members say, people are like, oh my gosh, I remember I called my aunt when I was hospitalized, and she's like, you don't belong there with those people. And I remember, like, at that time, I'm like, I thought that I didn't belong there with those people. And when in reality I did. And so people that I was closest to, such as my aunt and my mom and my grandmother, like, they had no idea that I was struggling and that I was in that much pain, to the point where I stopped functioning. I wasn't able to work. I stopped eating. I was just in the bed for days at a time, and I was really paralyzed, essentially. And even when I got to the hospital, I was dehydrated from not having anything to eat or drink in about 3 or 4 days. So the thing is, I think it's important for people to understand that, mental health diagnosis, there's no one token look. It looks different on every single person. And especially when you're exposed to trauma and it goes unresolved, it will resurface in some form, and you may not realize that it resurfaced when you try to suppress it. But it shows up in the way that you view the world. It shows up in your behavior. And through therapy, I started to really connect the dots of, why do I think the way that I think? Why do I behave the way that I behave? What are my stressors or my triggers that contribute to me not being well? And it really took me going beneath the surface and not attaching my mental health or myself to the degrees that I have, or my ambition or my drive, because I've always been very ambitious and driven. But at the same time, that doesn't exempt me from the mental health challenges that I was having. And what I have found through my experience is that so many people, we are hurting and we're walking around broken, and being broken is so normalized that we don't even realize that we're broken, and we're seeking validation from other people, or we're getting into relationships because we think that the other person will make us feel whole or complete, when no one can really do that for you. You have to be willing to do your own work and go beneath the surface, or we attach our value to material. So we're constantly buying clothes or a new car every year or a bigger house, and you think that those things are going to fill those voids. But what you will find is, just like the new car smell fades, those things will fade, and you will always find yourself seeking something else to fill that void or those voids within your heart.
You have said a lot. And one of the things I heard you say was trauma and the importance of not overlooking trauma. Most of us I will say in the Black community, as well as in many other communities, it's called survival. So you go through life like a horse with blinders on, and you go from one traumatic situation to the next, and you just kind of like, I just have to get through this. I just have to get through this. I just have to get through this. And before you know this, you have this whole trunk load of traumatic events that you've never processed. So I would really like to hear you talk a little bit more about trauma, what it is, because many people think that they have never experienced trauma. If you say something to them, they'll say, oh, that doesn't matter. It was just something that happened. Just something that happened, I got over it. I'm fine. No, you're not. And like you said, it shows up in the rest of your life. The relationships that you start, even the work that you do, it all keeps showing up. So trauma is really, really an important topic. And I would love for our audience to hear more about what trauma is so that they can start identifying the traumas that they have experienced in their lives. Could you do that for us?
Absolutely. So I can speak from what I know, as not a mental health professional, but this is just from my advocacy work and my personal experiences. But trauma can be anything in the form from, it could be a fender bender for some people with a car accident. It can be anything from sexual assault. It can be verbal or physical, mental abuse. There's no one look essentially from trauma. And what ends up happening is that when we don't process those experiences in our lives, it essentially stops. Like you said, we kind of go into survival mode because, we're told in the Black community, like, you got to either just pray and keep it moving. And we do come from a long lineage of trauma. When you think about us being stripped of our culture in Africa and you being given a new name, you're taken away from your family and all that, you're devalued, you're treated like an animal or even less than an animal. That's a very traumatic experience. And then to come to a new place, and when you get to this new place, you have trauma after trauma. So you think about the civil rights era and Jim Crow. Separate, when you're being when we were segregated, that's a traumatic experience. And then when you think in terms of the family, sometimes you have a relative like an uncle or a father, someone who's doing things such as molesting a child, and then the family acts as if or they sweep it under the rug, act like nothing ever happened. That's a very traumatic experience. And so I think for me, what I have found that it's really prevalent, of course, in not just communities of color, but people who experience poverty go through a lot of trauma. And so I think it's important that we address those things that stop us being able to function at our maximum capacity. And when trauma happens, we're not able to do that if we don't process it properly. And since trauma is so normalized for us, how we functioning broken, of not processing these traumas, it just becomes a part of our everyday lives, and we don't even realize that it's impacting us. So I think the biggest thing for trauma is us to realize what are those things in our lives that are stopping us from excelling and being the best version of ourselves. Those areas in our lives that left a hole in our heart. Those areas in our life that left us feeling broken or hopeless or less than or unworthy. Those things that really change the trajectory of our lives. And so it can be, like I said, anything from a car accident to something as a sexual assault.
Okay.
Yes, I agree. I'm glad you touched on that, because one of the things that I've learned from my own experience is I must step outside myself pretty often and start looking inside. And I think that's a key point, to start to look inside. And some things you're going to like and some things you're not going to like. And just be still and start to be with you. Now, with that being said, a lot of people don't know how to start that road. So can you talk about how people can begin to really connect with themselves?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest things, you will always hear me, no matter if I'm speaking on a podcast or if I'm speaking in public, I will always recommend to get connected to a therapist, because therapy has truly changed my life. And I understand when I was younger, or just growing up rather, I often heard that therapy was for crazy people. And I will be the one to constantly dispel the myth that it's not for crazy people. If you want to live your best life, then therapy is the place to help you to go beneath the surface to start dealing with those. And so the way that you can get connected with a therapist is contacting your insurance, if you have insurance. If not, you can also, there are resources such as the Open Path Collective .org, where you can find a therapist on a sliding scale if you don't have insurance. There are also, different mental health peer support groups through the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and you'll be able to talk to other people who have similar experiences that will be able to help you to work through some of the things. But the biggest thing for me has been therapy, because therapy has given me a free space where I don't have to worry about being judged. So it's a space where you can truly take off that mask that we tend to wear every single day and act like everything is okay, when deep down we know that we're not okay. And so I would always recommend that's when I started to see a change, and understanding that finding the therapist that is the right fit for you. It may not be the first therapist. Sometimes finding the right therapist is like dating. You have to find a few. And so something that was important for me was to have a Black therapist. I was very adamant about having a Black woman, because that was who I felt comfortable with. And so I've been working with my therapist for almost 4 years, and I see the progress that I've made from 2015 to 2019. It's like a completely new person. And it does take time, realizing that you're not going to go into one session and walk out and say, I'm a new person. You will discover things about yourself that you don't like, and you have to work toward being the person that you desire to become. But then also learning that in that space to sit with those emotions that may be very uncomfortable. Because a lot of times we try to no, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to cry. I don't want to feel sadness. I got to keep moving. People are like, I'm got to take care of my kids. I got to pay my bills. But at the same time, I'm not a parent. But what I know is that in order to be the best parent that you can possibly be, you have to make sure that you're whole and that you're emotionally and mentally stable to be the best parent that you can be. A lot of times parents do the best that, like for instance, my mom did the best that she can do, but she had a lot of things that she hasn't processed and is still working to process that hindered some of the things that she might have been able to do differently if she would have worked through some of her experiences. And so I think it's important that there are so many different forms of therapy. There's not just talk therapy, there's art therapy. There's also dialectical behavioral therapy, and really figuring out, what form of therapy is the best thing for you. But I will always start with a therapist and then working your way from there, because once you're able to connect with the therapist, then you will be able to identify what are some of the things that you need to do to focus on your mental wellness.
Okay. Now, let me ask one other question. Of course, there's coaches and there's therapists. So when do you think a coach is a good choice?
Yeah, so I would say a coach is a good choice if a person has, say for instance, you may get a fitness coach because you're wanting to eat healthier and you want to lose weight, or you want to maintain your weight. That or you may get a life coach or a career coach if you want to work toward elevating and progressing in your career. But the difference is with the therapist. A therapist can treat mental health disorders. A life coach cannot. But there are some therapists who do therapy and life coaching. It's just that the models essentially are different. So a therapist will be able to they use the DSM-5, which is basically like the Bible of mental health diagnosis. They'll be able to, if a person does have a diagnosis, they'll be able to treat that diagnosis. But I believe that once a person has gotten to a great place in their recovery or in their mental health, they may very well no longer need therapy, and they can sometimes those individuals can transition to maybe like a life coach. Or like, for instance, one of the things that I support is I'm currently working on my certification as a recovery coach, or as some call it a recovery coach. Some also call it's a peer recovery specialist. And essentially what that is, I'm able, I'm in the mental health field, but I'm able to work with individuals who live with either substance disorders or mental health diagnoses or intellectual disabilities such as autism. And I'm able to use my personal experience of living with a mental health diagnosis and share that and help them reach some of their goals. So I support individuals who they may live in residential, and they may have lived in residential for years and may have never lived independently, and they have the goal of moving out of essentially like a group home setting to living independently. Or maybe they want to work. The thing is, sometimes society tends to place barriers or limitations upon people who have been given a label. And I want to show them that despite living with a mental health condition, is that you can live a fulfilled and productive life. And so research is showing now that when you have people who are peers, essentially, I wish I had a me, if that makes sense, when I got out of the hospital, if I was connected with a peer recovery specialist on top of having my therapist, on top of having my psychiatrist, then it was like I can have a holistic, essentially, treatment. And so the thing is, life coaches or coaches, they're really great because they can help you reach some of your goals that are important to you. Maybe it's returning to school. Maybe it's paying, maybe it's reducing debt. Those things are some of the things that a coach can help you do. But what a coach can't do, they cannot treat, for instance, depression, or they can't treat bipolar disorder. Those are the things that they can't do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we go any further, how can our audience get in touch with you?
Yes, so they can find me on my website, which is www.firefliesunite.com, or they can connect with me on any form of social media, which is Fireflies, so FIREFLIES, and then pod, POD. On all forms of social media, they can reach me, and those are the best ways that they can reach me.
Okay. Wow, this has been definitely educational. I am really just sitting here thinking about some of the things that you've said thus far and some of the stigmas that's involved. Now, one of the things we talked about mental health and like in the Black communities, for example, and low income. But now we know that mental health issues also occur with the wealthy. And like we pointed out before, it doesn't choose people by status. Okay, so what are some of the things, like in terms of people that are in a higher income bracket, do you believe that they are pretty much have the same type of mindset in terms of denial, things of that nature? I think there's some similarities and at any income level. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, perfect example is, God rest his soul, Robin Williams. He was really struggling. And we may look at, well, he has all the money, he has all the materials. He may look at his accolades and think there's no possible way that something like that could happen. And he has also, from what I understand, has been open about his experiences and his challenges. But I think when you think in terms of people who come from a higher socioeconomic background, is sometimes we think that, well, money can be thrown at everything, or materials can be, they're easily accessible to get certain, materials. It's easy to, buy that Porsche, or it's easier to go on all these vacations because you have the means to do so. But at the same time, that will never, again, I think it goes back to feeling those voids or that hurt that we feel. And I think in terms of, just for instance, with suicide, sometimes I think in terms of people who have who come from money, it's easier for them to get access to a certain level of care, opposed to people who don't have that the money, or even if, for instance, they do get, let's say, medical assistance or Medicaid. Sometimes they don't have, they're unable to have the best doctors to treat their mental health challenges. And so sometimes the barriers could be that people who have the money, they're able to get a better quality of treatment, opposed to people who do not. So sometimes they're able to be able to get the resources that they need, whether it's a certain kind of therapy, whether it's a certain medication, it may be. And so I think sometimes that's where the barrier can come in. I was really fortunate at the time that when I did have my mental health challenges, I was under the age of 26 at the time, so I was still on my mother's health insurance. And with her being a federal government employee, I was able to get quality treatment. But that's not always the case for every single person. And I think when people do have money, I think it's just sometimes makes it a little bit easier. Does it mean that the work that they have to do to go beneath the surface is easier? Absolutely not. Because if I have said that working on myself has been harder than both of my degrees combined, myself has been the hardest research project, the hardest homework assignment. Like, that has been the hardest thing. And so I think whether you come from money or not, working on yourself is never going to be easy. But at the same time, what I have found is that it's the most rewarding thing. It's something that I can't explain. I think I talk about this in my book, and I say how, like, I believe that as humans, it's our birthright to be whole, to operate from a place of wholeness. But, we have to be willing to do the work. It's one thing to go to therapy. It's one thing to talk about the issues. It's another thing to actually walk out of therapy and start to apply those things that you've learned about yourself, or remove those things, such as removing toxic people from your life, or setting boundaries. Those things, that's the hard part. For me, it has been the easier part has been talking about it. The hard part has been actually being proactive in doing those things.
Along that line, T-Kea, let me ask you, and I know some people have issues with this, therapist, etc. Where do you see 12-step programs, the step work that's done in 12-step programs? Are you familiar with it?
So I'm somewhat familiar with it. I do know because I'm in the behavioral health field and, advocating, especially for instance, as a peer, there are some peers who focus on addiction. And so some of them, their treatment is 12 steps and, abstinence is their recovery. But what I'm also learning now, something that is new, that is people, especially in the state of Maryland, they're putting resources and finances into it, is harm reduction too. And so 12-step has been very beneficial for some people. Of course, I haven't personally been a member or have gone to any 12-step meetings just because my struggles has not been a substance use disorder. But I do know people who find that 12 steps really does work for them. And harm reduction is essentially where people can be monitored and lower their lower basically they're monitored and they're lowering the amount of drugs that they're using over time. And some people think, well, no, that's no, the only way to be clean is abstinence. But for some people, that may not be their recovery. Mm-hmm. And I think us understanding that there are multiple pathways to recovery, whether it's a mental health diagnosis or substance use disorder, that there's no one way. Different things work for different people. And so some people have, again, found 12 steps to be extremely beneficial for them.
Okay. I have a question because our listening audience, some people are sitting there saying, this rings a bell. What would you say to those who are listening who really know that they have an issue, but they've been running from it for a long time? What would you say to them that could help them get the gumption to step out and reach out for help? Because there are just millions of us who are in that situation, that we need help, but we have all these mental other blocks against reaching out for it, and frankly, lack the courage to just say, I need help. What can you say to these people?
Yeah, so I'll say a few things, but the first thing that I would say that it's okay to not be okay. It really is okay to admit and say, you know what, I'm not okay. And because once we admit that we accept that it's okay to not be okay, it'll make it a little bit easier to take the first step in getting the help that we need. Also understanding that you are not crazy. And I really do my best as I've been doing the advocacy work is to refrain from using those stigmatizing words, crazy, delusional, those stigmatizing words that perpetuate the stigma. So I would say to them too that you're not crazy. You're just a person who's gone through life and you've experienced things that hurt you, and it shaped the way that you view yourself and that you view the world and that you interact, and it impacts your relationships. And essentially, a lot of parents want to be the best mom or the best dad that they can be. They want to, be able to do all that they can do for their children. But I don't think sometimes parents maybe realize the mental roadblocks that can prevent them from being even better parents. And so my biggest thing is that I would say to them, and even if you are part of the Christian faith or no matter what your religion is, that it does not mean that you lack faith in God if you seek mental health treatment. That's not the case. I pray to God multiple times throughout the day, but I also see my therapist every single Friday at 12 o'clock, like clockwork. And so I think it's important that we understand that both of them, your faith as well as mental health treatment, they both have its benefits, and you don't have to pick one over the other. I would also say is that once I started to own my truth and say that this is what happened to me, and I sat down and processed it, I started to own it and say, like, yeah, that's my truth. And when you take that first step and you start to work through it, you will no longer become a victim of your circumstances, but you will become victorious over those circumstances. And I think that once we get to that point, we will realize how wholeness actually feels. Because I always say that I didn't even know that what I'm experiencing now, I didn't even think that it existed, because I was just walking around so broken. I had no idea what this wholeness felt like. But at the same time, once I got to this place, now I have, made it my mission to really start talking about it and explaining to people that it's okay to admit that you're not okay. And then once you do that, I'm reaching out to people who you are comfortable with. So whether it's a parent or a friend, someone in your faith-based community, a coworker, whoever you may find that you feel comfortable with, I think that, then people will be able to assist you. Or I think other things too that people can do is they can do things like listen to different mental health podcasts. So there's a podcast by Dr. Joy from Therapy for Black Girls. She has a website where you can find a therapist, but she also has a podcast. There are, of course, my podcast is not from the clinical standpoint, but it is from the perspective of the consumer. So people who battle with bipolar disorder, people who've overcome suicide or lost a loved one to suicide. So sometimes it's, once you hear stories of other people that are very similar, it helps give you the courage to take the first step. And so I think once realizing that it's not an isolated issue, like sometimes we feel like we're the only ones, like this is just happening to me, when there's someone who may be close to you, but there's definitely someone in this world who has experienced something similar. And I think when we hear those stories, it makes it a little bit easier for us. And so if someone wanted to, they can, of course, listen to my podcast if, they wanted to hear more stories like that. But then also having some of those resources, like I said, such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, where you could connect with other people who have similar challenges as you.
Well, thank you for that.
Before we wrap up, T-Kea, can you talk a little bit about your book?
Absolutely. So the title of my book is Saved and Depressed, a Suicide Survivor's Journey of Mental Health Healing and Faith. And so the reason why I named it Saved, of course, because I'm a part of the Christian faith. And sometimes it's like there's no way you can be saved by the grace of God and saved from going to hell and be depressed. Like, no, there's no, like, it's like, that's not even possible. And so I named it that because I wanted people to know that, yes, while I identify with the Christian faith, when I was in my darkest days, I pulled away from anything that had to do with church or God, because the one community that still remains one of my biggest support is the community that did not understand what I was going through. It's because they didn't have, it's not that they didn't want to help or they were being mean. Is that they were not educated on how to properly handle mental health challenges. So I was told to do things like, you need to pray more. You need to speak in tongues for 20 minutes a day. These are the things that I was told, because of course, for so long, Black people, we weren't getting mental health treatment. We were just, the church was our form of therapy. So that was what we did. We did the best with what we had. And so now that it's 2019, we don't just have to just go to church. And so I the reason why I wanted to share my story is because I talk about how I, didn't want to have anything to do with God. I stopped praying. I stopped listening to gospel music. I stopped going to church. I questioned if God even existed, because there was no way that all these things could have been happening to me. Or like, for instance, if a person attempts suicide, or if they die by suicide, they're going to hell. All those things that we hear it doesn't make it easier for us to want to open up and share our stories. It makes it harder for a person to want to even say anything to the church. And so I wanted to share my story to dispel any myths out there that a person was lacking faith because of their mental health challenges. And really, I talk in the book about, as I've stated before, experiencing wholeness. I talk about overcoming insecurities, things, struggling with body image challenges. I talk about the childhood trauma that I've experienced. I talk about the relationship that the Black community has with the church, because it has been the cornerstone of our community for so long. It's where we organize sit-ins. It's where we organize marches. So the church is truly has a major impact in our history. But also, the biggest thing is understanding and encouraging people to get the mental health treatment that they need, and know that there are resources out there. So I do offer resources as well in the book. But the biggest thing, I just want my story to be a testament that mental health treatment, that it works. And that as a result of me working on my mental health, then I was able to address even the church hurt that I was experiencing. And I have been able to rebuild my relationship with God over time, and even educate my church family, who loved me very much and wanted to help me, but didn't actually say the right things on the things that I needed to do. And so that's why I actually wrote the book, because I really wanted to educate people and essentially have my story as an example for someone who may be experiencing something similar.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That is really, and I think I've connected to a few groups now that are working with the churches in order to educate them on, when identifying what could be a mental health victim, and being able to provide the resources to better serve them. So I'm definitely hearing more about that as well. So before we wrap up, can you please give your information again?
Absolutely. So I can be found online at www.firefliesunite.com. And then you can also reach me on social media at Fireflies Pod, which is short for podcast. So that's POD at the end. But if you go directly to the website, it'll have my email and it'll have my social media platforms that you can connect with me on there too.
Okay. Well, this has been, there's never enough time when you're talking about, things that working from the inside out, I like to say, because that is so important, and there's so many moving parts to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And since we have met, this will not be our last encounter, because as I stated before, Just Minding My Business Media is definitely huge on this topic. We talk about this quite a bit, and we're going to be putting together a movie clip surrounding this. And we would love for you to be one of our headliners in this project.
Absolutely. Please feel free to reach out to me and let me know the information, and I would love to be.
Okay, excellent.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for all that you share this day with us.
Yes.
Very much appreciated.
Yes, it is a pleasure and an honor to be able to just share my story, to be on this side, and to say, like, I survived suicide, and I've done the work, and I always tear up because I'm in awe of how life has transformed for me. And I hope that other people can listen to my story and look at my story and say, wow, if she's done this, then maybe there is hope for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you know what? That's so important, T-Kea. Like I said, our listening audience, there is someone in our audience who has listened to this and may have been contemplating suicide or have been having suicidal thoughts. And it has given them hope. It has actually given them hope that, that's not the answer. There is always another way. There's always another way to get around the obstacles that life throws at us. So thank you so very much for your honesty, your directness, and for the fullness of what you had to offer to our audience. Thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you to the amazing women of a Sister Circle Empowerment Network, ASCEN LLC, and our media partners. Let Just Minding My Business Media promote your business. For information, visit us at jmb.asistercircle.org. That's jmb.asistaccircle.org. Voiceovers by RCH VoiceWorks. For when you want to be heard. Call 443-620-4115.
Thank you for tuning in to Just Minding My Business Radio. I'm your host, Ida Crawford.
And I'm your co-host, Ruth Haskins.
We hope you enjoyed the show and appreciate you stopping by. Many blessings to you and yours.